Let's see if you can fend for yourselves." Those were the last words Henry heard before the door slammed. Sitting in the middle of the dusty road, beside his sister Sophia and their old suitcases, he watched the black car pulling away. The man in a suit standing in front of the Rolls-Royce observed them in silence. Sophia squeezed her brother's hand harder when the man began walking toward them, and Henry felt cold sweat slide down his back, even under the unbearable heat of that afternoon. The stranger stopped 3 steps away and took off his sunglasses, revealing brown eyes that studied them with an intensity that made the boy want to disappear. He didn't know whether he should speak or keep quiet, so he chose to stay still, watching every move of this man who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine. The suit was far too immaculate for that dirty road, and the car behind him gleamed as if it had never seen dust in its life. "Hey everyone, Uncle Joel here. Let's dive into extraordinary stories with heart, edge, and unforgettable moments." The silence dragged on too long until the man crouched to be at their height, and Sophia instinctively leaned back, pressing her shoulders against a concrete utility pole that was already too hot to be comfortable. Henry stayed put because there was nowhere to go, and because a part of him still hoped that Black Car would come back to get them, though deep down he knew it wouldn't happen. "How long have you been here?" the man asked. His voice came out gentler than Henry had imagined, and that confused him even more because well-dressed people usually didn't talk like that to kids abandoned by the side of the road. "I don't know," Henry murmured too softly and had to repeat louder when he realized the man hadn't heard. "A few hours, maybe." The man looked up at the sky as if he could calculate exactly how much time had passed from the sun's position, then turned his eyes to the suitcases beside them. There were 3 in total, 2 patched cloth sacks and 1 actual suitcase so old the lock was broken and had to be tied shut with string so it wouldn't pop open on the way. "Were you traveling?" he asked, and there was something in the way he spoke that made it feel like he genuinely wanted the answer, not just filling time with empty questions. Sophia looked at Henry, waiting for him to reply, like it had always been since they were little. He was 2 years older, and that meant he was responsible for speaking to adults and making decisions, even when he didn't know what the right decision was. "Our parents left us here." The words tumbled out of Henry's mouth before he could think whether it was smart to tell a stranger. "They said they were leaving and we had to figure things out on our own." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, harder maybe, or sadder. Henry couldn't tell for sure. He had never been good at reading people, especially adults who always seemed to be thinking about 10 things at once. "Did they say where they were going?" the man asked, his voice still calm but with a tension beneath it, as if he were holding something larger inside. "No," Sophia said for the first time, her voice so low it was barely audible. "They just said they were tired of us and couldn't take it anymore." Henry felt a tightness in his chest hearing his sister repeat those words because he'd been trying to forget exactly what their parents had said before driving off. Their mother's eyes had been red, not from crying, but from anger. Their father hadn't even looked back when he set their bags down on the road and returned to the car. It had happened so fast, Henry hadn't understood what was going on until the car was too far to catch. "Do you have anyone else?" the man asked, and for the first time since he had stopped there, he seemed genuinely worried. It wasn't that fake concern some adults wore when they wanted to look kind, but a real worry that made his voice sound different. "We had our grandmother," Henry answered, feeling his throat tighten because talking about her still hurt too much. "But she died 5 months ago." The man closed his eyes for a second as if processing the information. When he opened them again, there was a determination there that hadn't existed before. He stood and looked both ways down the road, as if searching for something, or maybe just thinking what to do next. "Have you eaten today?" he asked, and Henry shook his head no because their last meal had been the night before, and even then it was just bread with butter their mom had tossed onto the table without a word. The man walked to the car and opened the back door, taking out a bottle of water and a package that looked like it held food. He returned and handed it to Henry, who looked at Sophia before accepting because he didn't know if they should trust a stranger. But thirst and hunger were stronger than fear. "Drink slowly," he said, watching them share the water. "You're dehydrated." Sophia took 3 big gulps and passed the bottle to Henry, who did the same. The water was cold and slid down his throat, bringing instant relief that made him realize how bad off he really was. The package held sandwiches wrapped in foil, and when Henry opened it, the smell of fresh bread and deli meats made his stomach growl so loudly even the man heard. "Go ahead and eat," he said. There was a gentleness in his voice that made Henry want to cry, but he held the tears back. He couldn't look weak in front of his little sister. They ate in silence while the man stood there watching the empty road. No car had passed in at least half an hour, and the sun was beginning to sink, painting the sky orange and red. Henry knew it would be dark soon, and the idea of spending the night there with no protection was too terrifying to consider. "What are your names?" the man asked after they finished eating. "Henry," he replied, then pointed to his sister. "And this is Sophia." "Nice to meet you both," the man said, and for the first time he showed something like a smile. "My name is Thomas." Henry felt awkward, not knowing what to say, because he had never been in a situation like this. There was no manual for talking to a millionaire who'd stopped to help two kids abandoned on the side of the road. Thomas looked again at their bags, then at the sky, which was darkening too fast. "I can't leave you here," he said, not as a question, but as a fact. "I'm taking you with me." Sophia clutched Henry's arm, and he felt her panic, because they had heard stories about people who took children away and they were never seen again. But at the same time, looking at Thomas didn't stir that kind of fear. There was something about him that seemed too honest to be dangerous. "Where to?" Henry asked, his voice steadier than he expected. "To my house first," Thomas answered. "Then we'll figure out the rest. But you can't stay here, and that's non-negotiable." Henry looked at Sophia, she looked back, and they spoke without words as they always did when decisions had to be made fast. She gave a small nod, and that was enough to know she agreed, even if she was scared. "Okay," Henry said, standing and helping Sophia up. Their legs were numb from sitting so long on the hot ground, and he stumbled a little before finding his balance. Thomas took the two bigger bags, leaving Henry the small one, and walked to the car. He opened the trunk and set everything inside with care before opening the back door for them. The Rolls-Royce's interior was more luxurious than anything Henry had ever seen. The seats were light beige leather, and there was a small screen on the back of the front seat. Sophia climbed in first and sank into the cushion like she was sitting on a cloud. Henry got in after and closed the door, feeling the blast of cool air on his sweaty skin. Thomas slid into the driver's seat and started the car, which made a sound so low it was almost silent. "Seatbelts," he said, glancing in the mirror, and waited until both were buckled before driving off. The car glided over the road with a smoothness that felt like floating. Henry looked out the window, watching the landscape shift from open fields to small houses, then to bigger buildings. They were heading the opposite way from where they'd come, which was good. It meant there was no risk of bumping into their parents by accident. "Have you ever been to the state capitol?" Thomas asked, breaking the quiet that had fallen inside the car. "No," Henry answered. "We always lived out in the country with our grandmother." "And your parents?" Thomas asked carefully, as if he knew it was a delicate subject. "They showed up from time to time," Henry said, anger rising in his chest. "But after Grandma died, they had to keep us, and they made it real clear they didn't want to." Sophia started to cry softly beside him, and Henry put an arm around her shoulders, trying to offer comfort he didn't feel himself. Thomas looked into the rear view again, his eyes meeting Henry's for a second before returning to the road. "I'm sorry for what happened," he said, and he seemed to truly mean it. "No child deserves that." Henry didn't reply. He didn't know what to say. The car stayed quiet another 20 minutes until they entered a neighborhood with huge houses and high walls. Thomas turned onto a wide street and stopped in front of a black iron gate that opened automatically as the car approached. The house beyond the gate was bigger than all the houses on Grandma's street put together. 3 stories, enormous windows, and a front garden that looked professionally maintained. Thomas parked by the garage and turned off the car, then looked back at them. "Welcome," he said with a small smile. "I know this is all very strange, but I promise you're safe here." Henry wanted to believe that more than anything, but after everything that had happened, he didn't know who to trust. The front door opened, and a woman around 50 in a grey uniform appeared in the entryway. She looked at the children in surprise, but said nothing. waiting for Thomas to approach. "Mrs. Beatrice," Thomas said when he reached her, "this is Henry and Sophia. They'll be staying here for a while." The woman studied them more carefully now, and her stern face softened a little when she saw the state they were in. Dusty clothes, sunburned faces, and most of all, the frightened eyes of two kids who had no idea what would happen next. "Of course, sir," she said, stepping aside to let them in. "I'll get the guest rooms ready." The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside. White marble floors and a wide staircase in the middle of the hall rising to the second floor. Henry felt like he was dirtying everything just by standing there, but Thomas didn't seem to care. "You must be exhausted," Thomas said, setting the bags down. "Mrs. Beatrice will show you where you'll sleep, and then you can shower and rest." Sophia squeezed Henry's hand again, and he realized she was trembling. Not from cold, but from nerves. Mrs. Beatrice gestured for them to follow and climbed the stairs with firm steps. The second floor had a long hallway with several doors on each side. She opened one midway, revealing a bedroom with a queen bed covered in white sheets and pillows that looked too soft to be real. "The girl can stay here," she said, then opened the door next to it. "And the boy here." Henry peeked into the second room, practically identical to the first, except the curtains were blue instead of pink. He didn't want to be separated from Sophia, but he knew they couldn't share a room forever. "Can I stay close to her?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. "Of course," Mrs. Beatrice said, and for the first time she almost smiled. "The rooms connect. There's a door between them you can leave open if you like." That made Henry feel a little better. Mrs. Beatrice showed the door hidden behind a wardrobe in his room that opened directly into Sophia's. "I'll bring towels and clean clothes," she said before leaving. "The bathroom is that door there. Use it as you need." When they were alone, Sophia stepped through the connecting door and sat on Henry's bed. The mattress dipped under her weight, and she bounced a little, testing the softness. "Do you think he'll send us back?" she asked. There was so much fear in her voice, Henry wanted to lie and say everything would be fine, but he couldn't. "I don't know," he answered honestly, "but at least tonight we have a place to sleep." She nodded and stared at her hands. A few minutes later, Mrs. Beatrice returned with a stack of fluffy towels and clothes that looked new. She set everything on the bed and explained how the shower worked before leaving again. Henry showered first, standing under the hot water for too long, trying to wash away the grime of the day. When he got out and put on the clean clothes she'd brought, he felt like another person. Just a simple white t-shirt and grey sweatpants, but they were the most comfortable clothes he'd ever worn. Sophia bathed after him, and when she came out with wet hair and a light yellow dress, she seemed a little less scared. They went downstairs together, following the smell of food. The kitchen was huge, with an island in the middle and white cabinets reaching the ceiling. Mrs. Beatrice was stirring something in a pot, and Thomas sat at the table with a glass of juice in his hand. "Sit," he said, pointing to two empty chairs. "Dinner's almost ready." They sat side by side, and Mrs. Beatrice served deep bowls of vegetable soup with big chunks of beef and potato. The smell was so good, Henry's mouth watered. "Eat slowly," Thomas warned. "If you haven't eaten properly today, your stomach may complain." Henry tried to follow his advice, but it was hard when the food was that delicious. Sophia ate 3 bowls, and Mrs. Beatrice seemed pleased to see them eat well. When they finished, Thomas took them to a room with a huge TV and white sofas. He turned on a cartoon Henry didn't recognize, but Sophia seemed to like it. "We'll talk more tomorrow," he said, getting up. "For now, rest and don't worry about anything." Henry wanted to ask so many things, but he was too tired to form complete sentences, so he just nodded. They watched TV for about an hour until Mrs. Beatrice appeared to say it was bedtime. The sheets were so soft, Henry sank into them the second he lay down. He left the connecting door open and could hear Sophia's breathing on the other side. Sleep came quickly, but before he drifted off completely, he heard his sister whisper from the other room, "Henry, do you think he's an angel?" Henry stared at the dark ceiling, trying to find an answer, but he couldn't, because he himself didn't know what to think about Thomas. The exhaustion of the day weighed on every muscle, but his mind kept racing through everything that had happened. From the moment their parents shut the car door to now, in a bed too comfortable to feel real. He rolled onto his side and through the connecting door could make out the outline of Sophia already asleep, her breathing heavy like someone who had finally found peace, even if only for a while. Morning light poured through the window when he woke. He sat up, disoriented for a second, until everything rushed back. The birds outside sounded so different from Grandma's house that for a moment Henry felt a pang of homesickness so sharp he had to sit back down. Sophia appeared in the connecting doorway, still in pajamas, eyes puffy with sleep and hair a mess. She came in without asking and sat beside him, saying nothing. She didn't need to. They sat that way until a knock on the door and Mrs. Beatrice entered carrying more clean clothes. "Good morning," she said in a voice not exactly warm, but not cold either. "Put these on and come down for breakfast. Mr. Thomas is waiting." The clothes were simple but good quality. For Henry, denim shorts and a green t-shirt. For Sophia, a light blue cotton dress with white embroidered flowers. They changed quickly and went downstairs, following the smell of fresh bread. Thomas sat at the table, reading something on his phone, but he set it aside when they walked in. He wore casual clothes instead of yesterday's suit, yet somehow still looked elegant in a way Henry had never seen on anyone. "Sleep well?" he asked, indicating the empty chairs at a table covered with food, breads, fruit, juice, cakes, and things Henry didn't even know the names of. "Yes, sir," Henry replied, because Grandma had taught him to call adults sir and ma'am. "Thank you for the food and the bed." "Just call me Thomas," he said, pouring orange juice into 2 glasses. "And you don't need to thank me." Anyone would have done the same. Henry doubted that. He knew enough people to know most would have driven right past without a second glance. But he said nothing, just started eating the buttered bread that was so soft it melted in his mouth. Sophia ate 3 slices of carrot cake and drank 2 glasses of juice before she finally looked satisfied. Thomas watched them with a kind of attention that wasn't uncomfortable, but made Henry wonder what he was thinking. When they finished, Mrs. Beatrice cleared the dishes and Thomas stood, gesturing for them to follow. He led them to an office on the 1st floor, its walls lined with books and a large dark wood desk. 2 chairs sat in front, and Thomas indicated they should sit before taking his place on the other side. "We need to talk about a few things," he began, his voice serious but not frightening. "First, I need to know more about your situation so I can help the best way possible." Henry's stomach twisted. He knew he would have to tell everything, and reliving those moments was the last thing he wanted. But he understood he didn't have a choice. So he started at the beginning, how they'd lived with Grandma since they were small because their parents never really wanted to take care of them, how Grandma was the only person who truly loved them, how everything fell apart when she had a heart attack in the kitchen while making dinner. Sophia began to cry when Henry told him about the funeral and how their parents had shown up only out of obligation, standing outside the church smoking while the coffin was lowered. Thomas handed her a box of tissues without interrupting. Henry continued, telling of the 5 months after that, living with their parents in the old house Grandma had left. How their mother was always complaining there wasn't money to raise 2 kids and their father spent whole days out, coming home only to sleep. How the food got scarcer until some days they ate only once, and even then it was the bare minimum. "They said they were tired," Henry said, his voice faltering a little, "that they'd given us too many chances and needed to live their lives without the weight on their backs." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, a restrained anger was there that scared Henry a little. But it wasn't directed at them. It was for what their parents had done. "Do you have any idea where they went?" he asked, already knowing the likely answer. "No," Sophia said, wiping her face with a tissue. "They just grabbed their suitcases and drove away." They didn't even look back. Silence stretched so long it felt like hours, though it was only minutes. Thomas turned a pen over between his fingers while he thought, and Henry could see him processing everything, trying to decide what to do. "Do you want me to try to find them?" he finally asked, his voice hesitant, as if unsure whether it was the right question. "No," Henry answered too quickly, and then felt bad for being brusque. "Sorry, it's just that I don't want to go back to them." "Not after what they did, I understand," Thomas said, and it sounded like he truly did. "Then we'll need to handle this another way." He explained that the right thing would be to notify Child Protective Services. but that would probably mean Henry and Sophia would be placed in a shelter until either a family could adopt them or their parents were located and forced to take responsibility. Neither option felt good, and Sophia's face showed she was thinking the same thing. "There is another possibility," Thomas said after a long pause. "I can try to get temporary guardianship while we resolve everything properly." Henry didn't know what to say. It sounded too good to be true. A stranger who found them on the road offering not only a roof, but a real chance at a better life. "Why would you do that?" he asked, needing to understand. "You don't know us." Thomas leaned back and looked out the window before answering. When he spoke, his voice was different, low and heavy, with something Henry couldn't identify. "Because I know what it's like to be abandoned," he said simply. "And I know if someone had helped me when I needed it, my life would have been very different." There was a story there Henry wanted to know, but he understood this wasn't the moment to ask. Thomas looked back at them with a resolve that hadn't been there before. "It won't be easy," he warned. "There will be red tape. They'll ask questions. They'll investigate everything about me and about you. But if you're willing, I'll do everything I can so you can stay here until it's all resolved." Sophia looked at Henry, waiting for him to decide like she always did, but this time he wasn't sure what was right. Staying with Thomas meant trusting someone they didn't know, and the system meant separation and uncertainty. "Can we think about it?" Henry asked, needing time to process. "Of course," Thomas said, standing. "Take all the time you need. Meanwhile, you stay here and don't worry about anything." They left the office and went back to their rooms. Henry flopped onto the bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to organize his thoughts. Sophia slipped through the connecting door and lay beside him. "I like him," she said after a while. "He seems nice." "I like him too," Henry admitted, "but I'm afraid to trust and have it go wrong." "It can't get worse than it was," Sophia replied, with a wisdom beyond her 8 years. "At least here we have food and a bed." She was right, and Henry knew it. They stayed that way for about an hour, talking things through, until they finally reached a decision. They went downstairs and found Thomas in the living room, reading a book. "We'll accept," Henry said before he could lose his nerve. "We want to stay here with you." Thomas closed the book and smiled in a way that lit up his whole face, the first real smile Henry had seen since they met. "Great," he said. "Then we'll start sorting everything out tomorrow. Today you rest and get used to the house." The rest of the day passed in a haze of newness. Thomas showed them every room, explaining they could use anything freely. There was a game room on the 3rd floor with a console and toys that looked barely used, a huge library with books from floor to ceiling, and even a pool in the back that shimmered blue under the afternoon sun. Sophia couldn't stop smiling, and Henry felt a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in months. They swam until their fingers wrinkled, then ate a lasagna Mrs. Beatrice had made, so good Henry kept eating until he couldn't manage another bite. When they went to bed that night, Henry felt more hopeful than he had in a long time. Maybe things really could get better. Maybe Thomas was the person who shows up when you need someone the most. The following days were a mix of boring meetings with social workers and attorneys who asked too many questions, and happy moments playing around the house and getting to know Thomas. He worked in finance and spent a lot of time in his office, but he always carved out time to have lunch with them and ask about their day. Mrs. Beatrice's stern look faded, and she began to smile more, especially when Sophia helped in the kitchen. Even though she didn't know much yet, Mrs. Beatrice taught her how to make cookies, and the smell of vanilla filled the whole house, reminding Henry of his grandmother and the afternoons they spent baking together in her kitchen. 2 weeks after they arrived, Thomas called them back to the office. Papers were spread across his desk, and he looked tired. But when he turned to them, there was a gleam of triumph in his eyes. "I got temporary guardianship," he announced. Henry felt a huge weight lift off his shoulders. "You can stay here legally for 6 months while the adoption process gets underway." "Adoption," Sophia blurted, eyes round and voice so high it almost cracked. "If you want," Thomas explained, a vulnerability in him now that hadn't been there before. "You don't have to decide yet, but it's a possibility. Meanwhile, you're safe here, and nobody can take you away against your will." Henry wanted to cry with relief, but he held it back. He didn't want to look weak. Sophia had no such qualms. She jumped from her chair and ran to hug Thomas, who looked surprised, but hugged her back gently. as if afraid she might break. The months that followed were the best of Henry's life. He and Sophia started at a private school nearby. For the first time, they had real friends and teachers who cared whether they were learning. Thomas showed up to every parent conference and school event, even when he was busy. He never missed anything important. At home, they settled into a comfortable routine: breakfast together before school, afternoons doing homework and playing, dinners where they talked about their day, and evenings watching movies on the big living room couch. Henry began calling him Thomas without the sir, and Sophia had already started calling him uncle, even without being asked. The only shadow in all that happiness was the memory of their parents, which returned now and then, mostly at night when Henry was almost asleep. He wondered if they thought about them, whether they regretted what they had done, or if they had simply moved on as if he and Sophia had never existed. One Saturday night, 4 months after they'd arrived, Henry went downstairs for water and found Thomas sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey, staring at the unlit fireplace. He noticed Henry and motioned for him to sit. "Can't sleep?" Thomas asked, voice a bit slow, as if he'd had more than one drink. "Just getting water," Henry said, but he sat anyway because something in Thomas's posture said he wanted company. They were quiet for a while, and then Thomas began to talk, as if opening a floodgate that had been closed for years. He told Henry about his own childhood in an orphanage after his mother died and his father disappeared. How he bounced from family to family without ever feeling at home anywhere. How he worked from 14 onward, saving until he could study and build everything he had. "I always wanted a family," he said, and there was a deep sadness in those words that made Henry's chest ache. "But I didn't think it would happen until I found you two on that road." Henry's chest tightened. He finally understood why Thomas had stopped. It wasn't pity or charity. It was recognition. He had seen in them a reflection of who he had been, and wanted to give them the chance he never had. "You saved us," Henry said, and for the first time he felt no shame in admitting it. Because it was the simple truth. "We would have died on that road if you hadn't stopped." "You saved me too," Thomas replied, eyes shining too brightly in the dim room. "This house was empty before you came. Now it finally feels like a home." They talked late into the night about things Henry had never discussed with anyone, about fears and hopes and how sometimes life places people in your path exactly when you need them most. When Henry finally went back to bed, he felt he had gained not only a roof, but someone who genuinely cared. The next morning, Thomas got up early and made pancakes for breakfast. It was Sunday, and he usually used the day to rest, but this time he was restless in a different way. He waited for them to finish eating and cleared his throat the way he did when about to say something important. "I want to ask you both a question," he began, and Henry noticed he was nervous from the way he played with his napkin. "Talking with Henry last night made me realize waiting any longer doesn't make sense. So I want to know officially if you'd like me to file for permanent adoption." Sophia dropped her fork with a clatter, eyes so wide they took up half her face. Something exploded inside Henry's chest, a mix of joy and relief and gratitude so big it didn't fit. "Really?" Sophia asked, voice thin and trembling. "Really," Thomas confirmed, now smiling too. "If you want, of course. You don't have to answer right away if you need time." "Yes," Henry said before he'd even finished processing the question. "We want that." Sophia leapt up so fast she almost knocked over her chair and ran to hug Thomas, who lifted her, even though she was already a bit big for that. Henry stood and joined them, and the three of them stayed like that in the kitchen while Mrs. Beatrice watched from the doorway, eyes brimming. The process was long and bureaucratic, like anything involving paperwork and court tends to be. There were interviews and visits from social workers who needed to be sure this really was the best option. They investigated everything about Thomas and about their parents, who were never found despite months of searching. It was as if they had disappeared without a trace. During that time, Henry and Sophia kept studying and adapting more and more to their new life. Better grades, more friends, more frequent smiles. It felt like they had finally found where they belonged. Thomas was present in every detail. He helped with homework, even when he didn't understand one bit of 5th grade math. He went to school performances and filmed everything on his phone. He took them to the doctor when they were sick and stayed up all night when they had fevers. He did everything a real father would, and then some. 8 months after they had been abandoned on the road, the judge finally approved the adoption, and Henry and Sophia officially became Thomas's children. The hearing was quick but emotional. When the judge banged the gavel, Sophia cried so much she soaked Thomas's shirt. The little celebration he organized was small, just the three of them and Mrs. Beatrice. But it was perfect. There was a huge 3-tier cake decorated with sugar flowers, and on top, in gold letters, it said family. There were presents wrapped in colorful paper and balloons filling the room. Thomas gave each of them a rectangular box wrapped in dark blue paper. Inside, Henry found a new birth certificate listing Thomas as father, and beneath it, a brand new state ID with Thomas's last name. Sophia received the same and stared at the documents as if they were made of gold. "Now it's official," Thomas said, voice catching. "You're my children, and nothing and no one will change that." They cut the cake and ate until they were queasy. They took photos, lots of them, because Mrs. Beatrice insisted, even while complaining she didn't know how to work the camera. They played with the balloons until they all popped. And at the end of the day, as the sun set, Henry looked out the living room window and saw a sky painted orange and red, just like it had been on that road. The difference was that now he had a real home. He had someone who had chosen them when the entire world had given up. He had a sister who was still his best friend, and a future that finally looked bright. That night, as they were getting ready for bed, Sophia appeared through the connecting door, which still always stayed open. She held the adoption decree in her hands, gazing at it like it was the most precious object in the world. "We have a real dad now," she said, so full of emotion that Henry's eyes stung. "Yeah," he agreed, pulling her to sit beside him on the bed. "And this time it's forever." They sat there looking at the documents that proved they were a real family, chosen, not by blood, but by love. After a while, Sophia went back to her room, and Henry lay down feeling a peace he had never known. He was almost asleep when he heard footsteps in the hall, and the door opened slowly. Thomas stood in the doorway with an uncertain expression. "May I come in?" he asked. Henry nodded and sat up. Thomas came in and sat on the edge of the bed, silent for a moment as if searching for the right words. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady. "I know I can't erase what your parents did," he began. "And I know nothing I do will take away the pain of being abandoned. But I want you to know that from today on, you'll never be alone again." Henry felt the tears finally spill over and didn't try to stop them. Thomas pulled him into a hug, and they stayed like that a long time. A man who had been abandoned as a child, holding a boy who had gone through the same. The two of them holding on together. When Thomas left and closed the door, Henry lay down again, and this time sleep came fast. He dreamed of his grandmother smiling at him from a distance, at peace. When he woke the next morning, he felt one chapter had closed and another had begun. The months that followed brought an even more settled routine and the kind of safety that comes from knowing nothing is about to change. Thomas wasn't perfect. Sometimes he got impatient when work stressed him out, and sometimes he forgot to pick them up from school. But he always apologized and always tried to do better. Henry joined the school's soccer team, and Thomas never missed a game, yelling and cheering louder than any other parent. Sophia joined the choir, and her sweet voice made Thomas cry every time she sang. They became a real family, with silly arguments and quick reconciliations, laughter echoing through the house and comfortable silences, new traditions like pizza every Friday night and walks in the park every Sunday morning. A year after the adoption, Henry was helping Thomas organize the office when he found an old box in the back of a cabinet. Inside were old photos. In one, a skinny, serious boy stared at the camera without smiling. It was Thomas, so different he was almost unrecognizable. "That was me," Thomas said, appearing behind him and looking at the photo. "A lost kid waiting for someone to find him." "But you made it," Henry replied, handing the photo back. "You built all this yourself?" "Not by myself," Thomas corrected, pulling another picture from the box, this one of an older man smiling. "This was Mr. Paul. He gave me my first job when I was 15, and nobody else wanted to hire a kid from a group home. He taught me about work and dignity, and when he died, he left me enough to start college." Henry looked at the photo of the man who had changed Thomas's life and realized good deeds create ripples that spread through time. "You're doing the same for us," he said. Thomas smiled that face-lighting smile. "And you'll do the same for others one day," he replied, putting the photos back. "That's how the world gets better, one person at a time." Life moved along with its ups and downs, as life does. Henry grew into a teenager who sometimes slammed doors and complained about everything, but who, deep down, loved the father he had gained. Sophia became a chatty girl who filled the house with friends and laughter. Thomas aged too. Silver strands appeared in his hair and wrinkles formed around his eyes, but he was happier than he had ever been. The house that had once been empty now overflowed with life. One Sunday afternoon, 5 years after the adoption, they were all watching a movie when the doorbell rang. Drop-ins were unusual. Thomas went to answer with a puzzled look. When he returned, he was pale and carried an envelope. He sat on the couch between Henry and Sophia and stared at it without opening. "What is it?" Henry asked, stomach tightening. He knew that worried look on Thomas's face. "It's from your biological parents," he said, voice tense. "They want to make contact." The silence that fell was so heavy it sucked the air from the room. Sophia gripped Henry's arm hard, and he felt anger rise from his stomach to his throat. 5 years without a word, 5 years living as if their children had never existed. And now they wanted to make contact. "We don't have to answer," Thomas said quickly, seeing their faces. "You owe them nothing. The decision is entirely yours." Henry took the envelope and looked at it. It was addressed to him and Sophia in a handwriting he vaguely recognized as their mother's. For a moment he thought of tearing it up unopened, but something stopped him. "I want to read it," he said, surprising himself. "Not because I want them back, because I need to know what it says." Thomas nodded and Sophia agreed. Henry opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a 2-page handwritten letter. As he read aloud, he felt his anger grow. The letter talked about regret and selfishness, about how they realized too late the mistake they'd made and wanted a chance to explain. It said they were in a better situation now and would like to try to rebuild the relationship if Henry and Sophia wanted. When he finished, Sophia was crying, but with rage, not sadness. She stood and walked to the window, turning her back. "They think they can just come back," she said, voice trembling. "After everything they did, they think we'll want anything to do with them." Henry didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to throw the letter away and pretend it had never arrived. Another part, small but present, felt curious about what had happened to them. Thomas stood and went to Sophia, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "You have every right to be angry," he said, calm but firm, "and every right to decide whether you want contact or not. There's no right or wrong answer here." Sophia turned and hugged Thomas, burying her face in his chest as she cried. Henry kept sitting, holding the letter and feeling the weight of a decision they would have to make. They spent days talking it over. Thomas never pushed either way. He just listened and offered perspectives when asked. Mrs. Beatrice shared her view. Forgiving didn't mean forgetting, but they weren't obligated to anything either. In the end, Henry and Sophia decided to write back. Not because they wanted their parents in their lives, but because they needed to say what they felt. The letter took a week to write, and when it was finished, it filled 3 pages with pain and anger, and also growth. They described what it was like to be abandoned on that road, about the fear and hunger and feeling worthless. They told them about Thomas and how he had given them everything their parents never did: unconditional love, safety, and the certainty that they mattered. At the end, they made it clear they weren't interested in rebuilding anything, because the family they had was all they needed. They wished them well, but asked that they not contact them again. When they mailed it, Henry felt lighter. It wasn't exactly forgiveness, but it was closure, turning the page and moving forward without carrying that bitterness forever. No reply ever came, and they didn't expect one. Life went on, and the episode slowly faded into the background, a footnote rather than the main chapter in their story. Henry graduated high school with honors and went to medical school because he wanted to help people the way Thomas had helped him. Sophia discovered a talent for drawing and started selling illustrations online, even as a teenager. Thomas grew older, the grey taking over completely now, but he was present at every milestone, Graduations, first relationships, first jobs, always cheering, always supporting. On the night of Henry's medical school graduation, 10 years after he'd been adopted, they were all gathered in the living room of the house that was still home. Thomas raised a glass of champagne and made a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, eyes shining as he looked at Henry and Sophia, "and to the families we choose." Henry lifted his glass and looked at the man who had once been a stranger on a road and had become the most important person in his life. "To the families we choose," he repeated, feeling gratitude fill every part of him. Sophia raised her glass too, and the three glasses chimed softly. Mrs. Beatrice, now with completely white hair, watched from the doorway with a smile. The house was full of life and love and stories still being written. Long after, when Henry was a practicing physician and Sophia a well-known illustrator, they went back together to the road where everything had begun. The pole was still there, and the road was still empty and dusty. But now, when they looked at that place, they didn't feel pain. They felt gratitude, because it was there they had found the person who changed everything. It was there their lives had truly restarted. Henry placed his hand on the pole where he had sat that terrible day and felt a deep peace. "Thank you," he said softly, not sure to whom or to what, but needing to say it anyway. Sophia stood beside him, and they remained there a few minutes in silence, staring at the road that had been the setting of the worst day of their lives, and also the beginning of something extraordinary. When they returned to the car, Thomas was leaning against the Rolls-Royce, which was nearly 15 years old now, but still immaculate. He looked at them and smiled that smile that still lit everything around him. "Ready to go home?" he asked, and Henry nodded. "Ready to go home." They got in, and the silence that followed was different, not uncomfortable, but reflective, as if each one were processing the meaning of returning to the place where it all began. Thomas drove slowly down the empty road, and Henry watched out the window as the landscape shifted from dry to green as they approached the city. Sophia rested her head on his shoulder, unusually quiet. He knew she was thinking the same things he was. How life can change completely in a matter of minutes. How a single act of kindness can save not just a day, but an entire life. By the time they arrived home, it was nearly evening, and Mrs. Beatrice had made their favorite dinner, a roast with potatoes and vegetables that filled the house with a smell that always made Henry feel at peace. They ate quietly, each lost in their thoughts, until Thomas cleared his throat the way he did when he had something important to say. "I never told you what that day was like for me," he began, and Henry froze with his fork in mid-air. "The day I stopped on the road and found you two." Sophia straightened in her chair, giving him her full attention. In all those years, Thomas had never spoken about it. He always said the present mattered more than the past, but now he seemed ready to share. Thomas said he had been driving back from a meeting that had been a disaster. He'd just lost a big deal and felt empty. The kind of emptiness you feel when you have everything but nothing that truly matters. He was driving on autopilot, thinking how his life made no sense, when he saw the two of them sitting by that pole with those old bags, and something inside him just knew he had to stop. He explained he wasn't afraid of them. He was afraid of not being able to help, of not being good enough, of making things worse. But when he looked into Henry's eyes and saw the same fear he had once felt as a child, he knew he at least had to try. Henry's throat tightened. He had never considered how important that day must have been to Thomas too. He had always thought it was simply an act of generosity. Now he understood it was much more. Thomas said they had given him a purpose he didn't know he was looking for. They had turned a wealthy man into a whole person. They finished dinner in a lighter mood after that, as if a weight none of them realized they were carrying had been lifted. Henry helped wash dishes while Sophia dried and Thomas put everything away. Later that night, Henry was in his room studying for an exam when his phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice he hadn't heard in years made his blood run cold. It was his mother, sounding older and tired. She asked him not to hang up and said she knew she had no right to call, that the letter had been clear, but she needed to hear his voice, needed to know if they were all right. Henry said they were more than all right, that without her and without their father, they had built a good life. Silence on the other end, then a muffled sob. She said she wasn't calling to ask for forgiveness, she just wanted him to know not a day went by without regret. Then she told him their father had died 3 months ago. His heart had been weak for some time. Henry thought he should feel something, but there was only a strange emptiness, as if he were hearing of the death of someone he didn't know. He said he was sorry, because that's what you say in such moments. She said that before he died, their father had talked about them, had said he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. "We don't need anything," Henry replied. "We have a real dad now, one who chose us every day." He hung up before she could answer and stared at the phone, heart racing. The bedroom door opened and Thomas came in, worried. He'd overheard part of the conversation. Henry told him everything, and Thomas listened without interrupting. "How are you feeling?" Thomas asked, sitting on the bed. Henry admitted he didn't know, that he felt like he should feel something, but he felt nothing. Thomas put a hand on his shoulder and said that wasn't wrong, that Henry owed them nothing and had the right to feel whatever he felt, or nothing at all. The next morning, Henry told Sophia. She listened quietly, tears in her eyes when he finished. She said she wasn't sad for their father, but for them, for the childhood they hadn't had. Henry understood, because he felt the same, but he also remembered they now had good memories and would make many more. A month later, Henry received a message saying their father had left them something in his will, and it needed to be delivered. He talked with Thomas and Sophia, and the three agreed they should at least find out what it was. They scheduled a meeting in a neutral cafe. Henry insisted on a public place. On the day, they arrived early and chose a table by the window. When their mother walked in, Henry barely recognized her. She had aged far beyond her years. She sat and pulled a large envelope from her purse. She explained their father had left half of everything he owned to them. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a considerable amount from a settlement he had received. Henry looked at the envelope without touching it. She said that in the last years, their father had changed. Illness had made him rethink everything. He had talked about them constantly, wondering where they were. When he found out about the adoption, he felt relieved because at least they were safe. "And you?" Sophia asked. "Do you regret it too?" Their mother looked at Sophia with tearful eyes and said she regretted it every day, that she couldn't keep anything because the guilt consumed her. Henry took the envelope and put it in his backpack. He would have been foolish to refuse money that could help Sophia. "Thank you for bringing this," he said, "but we don't want contact anymore. We have a family now, and you're not part of it." They left the cafe and Henry didn't look back once. In the car on the way home, Sophia cried softly. When they arrived, Thomas was waiting anxiously in the living room. Henry told him everything and showed the envelope, approximately $40,000. Sophia said she wanted to use it to open the studio she had always dreamed of, and Henry agreed. They accepted the money not as forgiveness, but as the barest compensation. The following weeks were full of paperwork, and their mother tried calling a few more times, but Henry never answered. With the money, Sophia opened a small illustration studio downtown. The space was tight but charming, with big windows. Thomas helped with the bureaucracy, and Henry spent weekends painting walls and assembling furniture. On opening day, they had a small party. Thomas watched proudly as Sophia showed everyone around. Mrs. Beatrice had made snacks and busied herself offering them to each person. Henry stood in a corner with a cup in hand, watching Sophia glow as she showed her illustrations. Thomas came to stand beside him. "She turned something bad into something good," he said. "She took money that came from pain and built a dream." Henry agreed. That was exactly it. Sophia had taken a heavy inheritance and turned it into something beautiful. The party lasted late, and on the way home Sophia couldn't stop talking about her plans, about clients she wanted to win and projects she dreamed of doing. Thomas drove, listening, and looked in the mirror at Henry smiling in the back seat. When they got home, Sophia hugged them both and said something that made Henry's chest tighten. "Thank you for everything. You're the only family I need." Henry smiled back and felt they had finally left the past behind for good. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but accepting that it didn't define who they were anymore. The house was quiet when they entered, and Mrs. Beatrice had already gone to bed, leaving a single light on in the kitchen. Thomas made hot chocolate for the three of them, and they sat in the living room discussing next steps for the studio. Sophia had a huge list of ideas and spoke with such enthusiasm it was impossible not to catch it. Henry watched her waving her hands as she talked and marveled at how the scared girl from the road had become this confident woman. The months that followed brought quick changes for everyone. Sophia's studio began to gain clients, and she worked practically every day. Illustrations for children's books and advertising campaigns. Henry was in his final year of medical school. Exams and shifts consumed almost all his time. Thomas was still working, but he had slowed down. He said he wanted to enjoy family more while he still had the chance, because life had taught him that money can be earned, but moments can't be recovered. He started coming home for lunch every day and always asked about each of their days, genuinely interested. One Thursday afternoon, Henry was on a hospital shift when Sophia called. Her voice sounded off, and he knew immediately something was wrong. She asked him to come home as soon as he could, but didn't want to explain over the phone. He managed to swap shifts with a colleague and rushed out. Traffic was heavy, every minute stuck in the car torture as he imagined what might have happened. When he finally got home, he found Sophia and Mrs. Beatrice on the couch with serious expressions. "Where's Thomas?" was the first thing he asked, panic rising. Sophia explained that Thomas had collapsed in his office during a meeting and had been taken to the hospital. He was conscious now, but the doctors wanted tests. They suspected something serious. Henry felt the ground disappear beneath him. They went straight to the hospital and found Thomas in a private room. He lay in bed with some monitors hooked up, but he smiled when they came in, trying to look okay. Henry didn't buy it. He knew that smile and what it hid. "It's nothing serious," Thomas said before they could ask. "Just a scare. The doctor said I'm working too much and need rest." But the way he looked away while speaking made Henry suspect there was more. He asked to speak with the doctor and learned Thomas had had a mild heart attack. Not severe, but a serious warning to change his lifestyle. When he returned, Thomas was speaking softly with Sophia, whose eyes were red from crying. Henry sat by the bed without a word. He didn't trust his voice. Thomas looked at him and, seeing something in his face, sighed. "The doctor told you?" Not a question, a statement. Henry nodded. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was a rare vulnerability. He explained he had known about heart problems for months, but hadn't wanted to worry anyone. He thought he could control it with meds and simple changes, but he had underestimated it. Sophia began to cry harder. Thomas reached out and she squeezed his hand. Henry's throat tightened, but he couldn't break down now. Someone had to stay calm. He asked about treatment and prognosis, and Thomas explained he would need surgery to place stents, but the chances of success were high. They spent the night at the hospital, rotating between his room and the waiting area. Mrs. Beatrice arrived early the next morning with clean clothes and food, because she knew none of them would have thought of it. The surgery was scheduled for 2 days later, and those 48 hours were the longest of Henry's life. Thomas was discharged home temporarily, but he was too quiet. He spent hours in the living room armchair, staring out the window, lost in thought. Henry tried to talk several times, but Thomas always said he was fine and changed the subject. The night before surgery, Henry couldn't sleep and went down for water. He found Thomas in the kitchen, sitting in the dark with a cup of tea. He startled when Henry flipped on the light, then motioned for him to sit. "Can't sleep either?" Thomas asked, voice tired. Henry admitted he was too worried to relax. They sat in silence a while until Thomas started talking about practical matters. Where important documents were, passwords to bank accounts. Henry cut him off. He didn't want to hear it because nothing was going to go wrong. "I know it'll probably be fine," Thomas said, "but I need to be sure you'll be okay if anything happens." Tears rose, and for the first time in years, Henry didn't hold them back. Thomas stood and hugged him, letting him cry on his shoulder. When they pulled apart, Thomas's eyes were red too. "You gave me everything," Henry managed. "A home, a family, a future. I don't know what I'd be without you." Thomas smiled and said it was the opposite, that Henry and Sophia had given meaning to a life that had been empty. They had turned a house into a home and a lonely man into a father. They talked until sunrise, about everything and nothing. On surgery day, they arrived at the hospital early. Thomas was very calm, as if at peace with any outcome. He hugged Sophia and Henry before being taken to the OR and told them he loved them. He said it often, but this time the words carried a different weight. The 6 hours of waiting were torture. Henry paced the hallway while Sophia whispered prayers on an uncomfortable chair. Mrs. Beatrice came too, knitting something just to keep her hands busy. Every minute felt like forever. When the surgeon finally came out, mask hanging at his neck, Henry's heart stopped. He tried to read the doctor's face first, but it was impossible. The doctor pulled off his cap and smiled, tired. The surgery had been a success. Henry's knees nearly gave out with relief, and Sophia hugged him, crying. The doctor explained Thomas was in recovery but would be transferred to a room soon. They could see him in a few hours. Everything had gone better than expected, and with proper care he had many years ahead. When they finally saw him, Thomas was awake but drowsy from the meds. He smiled and reached out. They each took a hand. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. Their presence said it all. The days of recovery in the hospital were slow but steady. Thomas improved a little each day, and within a week he was complaining about hospital food. A good sign. Henry practically lived at the hospital, sleeping in an uncomfortable recliner in Thomas's room. Sophia came every day after work and spent afternoons telling him about the studio and new projects. She brought drawings to show, and Thomas offered opinions and suggestions. It was their routine, and keeping it helped normalize the situation. When Thomas was discharged, with a long list of medical recommendations, they returned home, and Mrs. Beatrice had prepared everything. She had reorganized the master bedroom to make moving around easier and stocked the fridge with healthy foods, faithfully following the nutrition guidelines. Thomas had to relearn how to slow down. A man who had always been active and hard-working now had to nap in the afternoon and take short walks instead of running. At first he got frustrated, but little by little he accepted it, and even began to enjoy the slower pace. Henry took on most of the caregiving because he was a doctor and understood the needs best. He tracked Thomas's blood pressure twice a day and made sure he took his meds on time. It was a strange role reversal, but necessary. 3 months after surgery, Thomas looked noticeably better, color back in his face, energy almost fully returned. He couldn't go back to full-time work yet, but he was already taking online meetings and consulting. Around that time, Henry finally graduated from medical school. The ceremony was moving, and Thomas sat in the front row with a camera, filming everything. When they called Henry's name and he walked on stage, Thomas stood and clapped louder than anyone. Afterward, they took photos in front of the school, Henry in cap and gown holding his diploma, Thomas and Sophia on either side. Mrs. Beatrice insisted on at least 20 pictures from different angles, saying she had to document everything. "I am so proud of you," Thomas told him when they had a quiet moment. "You've become the man I always knew you would." Henry hugged him and thanked him for everything. For stopping on that road, for believing in him when no one else did, for giving him a chance no one else would have. The party was at home with only family and a few close friends. Sophia had made a huge cake decorated with a fondant stethoscope. They ate and laughed, and Henry felt complete in a way he'd never felt before. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet again, Henry went out to the garden and looked up at the stars. He heard footsteps. Thomas came and sat beside him on the wooden bench. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked. Henry said he was thinking how strange life was, how a terrible day on a road had become the best thing that ever happened to him, how sometimes the end of something is actually the beginning of something much better. Thomas agreed. He thought about that too, how that day had saved not only Henry and Sophia, but also himself, giving purpose to a life that was becoming empty despite all the material wealth. "Have you ever thought about having your own kids?" Henry asked suddenly. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said he had. Before meeting them, he had even considered adopting, but he was never sure he'd be a good father. After Henry and Sophia came along, that doubt vanished. He finally understood what being a father truly meant. "It's not about blood," Thomas said. "It's about choice. Waking up every day and deciding to be present, to be reliable, to be the safe harbor every child deserves." Henry agreed and said Thomas had been all that and more, the example he'd follow when it was his time to have children. Life kept moving. Henry started a pediatrics residency at a public hospital. The shifts were long and exhausting, but he loved every minute, finally doing what he'd always wanted. Sophia's studio grew. She hired 2 assistants and took on bigger projects. She had a meeting with a major publisher that wanted her to illustrate an entire children's series, her dream project, and she threw herself into it. Thomas returned to work part-time and was happy that way. He said surgery had been the wake-up call he needed to re-evaluate his priorities. He spent mornings working and afternoons with family, simple things like walking in the park or watching movies. About a year after graduation, Henry came home with news. He had been accepted for a specialty fellowship in pediatric cardiology at one of the best hospitals in the country. An incredible opportunity, but it meant moving to another city for 2 years. The news brought mixed emotions. Thomas and Sophia were immensely proud, but sad at the thought of being apart. They had never been away from each other for more than a few days since becoming a family. "You have to go," Thomas said when Henry hesitated. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and we'll be fine." Sophia agreed. 2 years would fly by, and the internet made staying close easy. Henry still hesitated. He didn't want to leave Thomas, especially after the heart scare, but they insisted he go. The move happened 2 months later, and the day of the farewell was one of the hardest. Mrs. Beatrice made a special breakfast, and everyone pretended they weren't about to cry. At the airport, Henry hugged each of them for a long time. "No matter the distance," Thomas said, holding Henry's face in both hands, "you'll always be my son, and this will always be your home." Henry nodded, throat too tight to speak, and when he finally passed through the gate, he looked back one last time, seeing the 3 of them waving. The flight felt like seconds. He spent it thinking about all he was leaving, even knowing it was temporary. The new city was bigger and busier than he expected. The apartment he rented was small and felt empty compared to the house he'd grown up in. That first night alone was strange. He called home 3 times just to hear Thomas's and Sophia's voices. They talked for hours about nothing important, just filling the emptiness of distance. The first months were intense, his fellowship even more demanding than medical school had been. He spent entire days at the hospital learning from the best pediatric cardiologists in the country. It was exhausting but rewarding. Every child he helped made the effort worth it. He called home every day without fail. Sometimes long conversations about the day, other times just a few minutes to say goodnight. Thomas always asked if he was eating well, and Sophia always had a funny studio story. Sometimes Mrs. Beatrice grabbed the phone just to complain he was too far away. 3 months after the move, Henry met Camille on a shift. She was a pediatric nurse with a way with kids he admired. They started grabbing coffee on breaks, and little by little it turned into something more. When Henry told the family about her on a video call, Sophia squealed with excitement, and Thomas smiled that happy, slightly melancholy smile every father gets when he realizes his child is growing up. They asked 1,000 questions about Camille, and Henry answered them all with butterflies in his stomach. The relationship unfolded naturally. Camille knew Henry's story. He had told her everything from the start. She was moved when he talked about Thomas and how a stranger had completely changed his life's trajectory. 6 months later, Henry brought Camille home to meet the family. It was a long weekend, and he was more nervous than he expected. Sophia opened the door before they could ring and hugged Camille like an old friend. Thomas was more reserved at first, observing, weighing. But soon he was chatting and asking questions. Mrs. Beatrice made a special dinner and was pleased when Camille ate 3 helpings, saying it was delicious. By the end of the weekend, Camille had won everyone over. "She's special," Thomas told Henry privately. "You can see she makes you happy." Henry admitted he was happier than he had been in a long time. Thomas put a hand on his shoulder and said that was all he ever wanted, to see his children happy and thriving, building their own lives. The first year of the fellowship flew by, shifts, study, and monthly visits home. Henry missed them, but he was building something important, professionally and personally. Camille became essential to his routine. He couldn't imagine life without her. On one of those visits, Thomas gathered Henry and Sophia for a serious talk. They sat in the living room, and from his expression, they knew it was important. Thomas explained he had decided to retire completely. The last few years had taught him life was too short to spend all of it working. He wanted to enjoy while he still had health and energy to do things he'd always postponed. Sophia asked what he planned to do, and Thomas smiled. He wanted to travel. The idea was to spend 6 months visiting places he had always dreamed about. He had started planning and wanted to be sure they would be fine while he was away. Henry and Sophia exchanged looks and agreed immediately. Thomas deserved to live for himself after living so much for them. 2 weeks later, Thomas left on his first trip. He sent photos every day of amazing places, looking younger and lighter in each one. Henry felt proud. Thomas was finally doing something just for himself. Meanwhile, Henry's life sped up. The fellowship entered its 2nd year. He was considering a subspecialty in pediatric cardiology research. Camille moved into his apartment, and living together only confirmed she was the right person. Sophia's studio grew so much she had to rent a bigger space. She had just signed with the publisher to illustrate a 12-book children's series, her dream project, and she was fully dedicated. Thomas returned after 4 months, tanned, full of stories. He had visited 8 countries and said it was the best experience of his life. He brought gifts for everyone and spent hours showing photos and telling about each place. That night at dinner, Henry finally worked up the courage to make an announcement. He took Camille's hand and looked at Thomas and Sophia before speaking. He had asked Camille to marry him, and she had said yes. Sophia shrieked so loudly that Mrs. Beatrice rushed from the kitchen, thinking something terrible had happened. Thomas stood and hugged Henry, saying he was beyond happy. Then he hugged Camille and said she was already part of the family, but now it would be official. The following months were full of wedding planning. Camille and Sophia teamed up, and Henry just agreed to everything. He knew it would be perfect no matter what. Thomas offered to pay for it all, but Henry insisted on splitting costs. He was working now. The ceremony was set for late spring in a beautiful garden outside the city. Small, just family and close friends. Henry asked Thomas to be his best man. When he asked formally, Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "It would be an honor," he said, voice breaking. "Thank you for giving me this privilege." The last months of the fellowship were the busiest. Intense work plus wedding prep. Henry slept little but was happier than ever. Everything in his life had fallen into place. A week before the wedding, the whole family gathered at the house for final details. Sophia was finishing the handmade invitations. She insisted on a personal touch. Camille and Mrs. Beatrice coordinated the menu, and Thomas watched it all with a contented smile. That night, Henry couldn't sleep and went out to the garden, something he always did when he needed to think. Thomas joined him a few minutes later, bringing 2 beers, and sat beside him on the bench. "Nervous about the wedding?" he asked, offering a bottle. Henry said he wasn't nervous, just eager that he could hardly wait to start this new phase. They drank in silence under the stars until Henry asked something that had been on his mind. "Did you ever think about getting married?" The question slipped out before he could decide if it was appropriate. Thomas took his time. He said he had been in love once, long ago, an incredible woman, but she wanted biological children and he hadn't felt ready to adopt at the time. They ended it. Sometimes he thought of her, wondering how life might have been if he'd chosen differently. But soon after that breakup, he found Henry and Sophia on the road and realized the universe had better plans. "I don't regret anything," he said, "because everything led me to you, and you're the best thing that ever happened to me." Henry felt emotion tighten his chest and said he felt the same, that Thomas had given them everything they needed and more: father, friend, mentor, example. Thomas hugged him, and they stayed that way, just appreciating the moment. The wedding day dawned perfect. Blue sky, pleasant temperature. The ceremony was set for late afternoon, when the light would be golden and ideal for photos. Henry woke early, despite sleeping little. He was too excited. Thomas helped him get ready, and while straightening his tie, said something that nearly made Henry cry. He'd imagined this moment so many times since they were kids, always knowing Henry would become an incredible man. "You make me proud every day," Thomas said, fixing his jacket. "Today is no different." "I'm so happy to be at your side." Henry hugged him tight and thanked him again for everything. For stopping on that road, for believing when no one else did, for being there at every important moment. Thomas said he would do it all again without hesitation. The ceremony was beautiful and emotional. Camille walked in radiant in a simple, elegant dress. Henry waited at the altar with Thomas beside him holding the rings. When they exchanged vows, almost no one kept from crying. Sophia, the maid of honor, gave a speech so lovely about love and family that even guests who didn't know them well were moved. She spoke of Henry as the most protective brother and how he deserved every happiness. Then it was Thomas's turn. He walked up holding a piece of paper, but when he reached the mic, he pocketed it and spoke from the heart. He told, briefly, the story of finding two siblings abandoned on a road and how that day had changed his life completely. Seeing Henry there, getting married, was proof that happy endings sometimes do exist, that sometimes life puts the right people in each other's paths at precisely the right time. He ended by saying how proud he was of the man Henry had become. The party lasted late, music, dancing, lots of food. Henry danced with Camille, with Sophia, and at last with Mrs. Beatrice, who protested she was too old to dance, but laughed the whole time. When it came time for the father-son dance, Thomas was visibly emotional. They danced in the middle of the room as everyone watched and snapped photos. Henry rested his head on Thomas's shoulder and whispered that he loved him. Thomas said it back and hugged tighter. It was a moment both would carry forever. At the end of the night, when only family remained, Henry looked around and felt immense gratitude. Camille chatted with Sophia about the honeymoon. Mrs. Beatrice gathered the last glasses. Thomas watched it all with a tired but happy smile. Henry went to him, and they stood side by side, taking in their family. Thomas draped an arm over Henry's shoulders and said something that summed it all up. "We built something beautiful here, didn't we?" It wasn't a question, but a statement. Henry agreed. They had taken broken pieces and made something whole, creating a true home where everyone felt loved and safe. Thomas nodded, and they stayed a few minutes longer before heading to bed. The honeymoon was at a resort in Florida for 2 weeks, and for the first time in years, Henry completely unplugged from work. He and Camille enjoyed every second, swimming in the ocean, going on excursions, planning their future. When they returned, the routine started again, but with a different feel. Henry had finished his fellowship and received an offer to work at the same hospital where he had trained. It was an excellent proposal and meant staying in that city. He talked with Camille, who also liked the city and had a good job. He talked with Thomas, who said what mattered was Henry's happiness. Distance would change nothing between them. So Henry accepted. Sophia visited a month later to see the new apartment they had rented. Bigger than the last, with an extra room they planned as an office. She loved it and stayed a week, taking time to explore the city. During the visit, she said she'd met someone, a graphic designer who worked in her building. Henry asked 1,000 questions. She answered them all, laughing and admitting it was early, but she felt it could be something special. The months that followed brought stability and growth for everyone. Henry settled into his new job and earned his colleagues' respect. Camille got a promotion, Sophia grew more serious with her boyfriend, and Thomas began volunteering with at-risk kids. A year after the wedding, Henry got a phone call in the middle of the night. It was Sophia, and from her voice, he knew something was wrong. She said Thomas had collapsed and was on the way to the hospital, his heart. Henry and Camille caught the first flight they could and arrived 4 hours later. They hurried to the hospital and found Sophia in the waiting room, face swollen from crying. She said Thomas had had another heart attack, worse this time. They waited hours until a doctor finally came. The procedure had been more complicated than the previous one, but Thomas was stable. He would need to stay hospitalized at least 2 weeks and then face a long recovery. When they finally saw him, Thomas was awake but weaker. He smiled when they entered and joked about getting too old. No one laughed. It was too scary seeing him like that. Henry held his hand and said he would stay as long as it took. Thomas protested that Henry had work, but Henry was firm. Family came first, always. The 2 weeks in the hospital were hard, especially because Thomas hated being idle. He complained about the food, the strict schedules, the lack of privacy, but slowly he improved and regained strength. When he was discharged, the doctors were clear about limitations. Thomas would need serious lifestyle changes and constant monitoring. Henry decided to stay another month to make sure everything was under control. During that month back in the house where he grew up, Henry noticed how much Thomas had aged. His hair was completely white now, and he moved slower. It was strange to see the man who had always seemed invincible so fragile. But even so, Thomas was the same. Still cracking jokes, still caring more about others than himself, still the center holding the family together. Henry spent that month caring for him and reminiscing. One night, the two of them were on the porch when Thomas said something that caught Henry off guard. He said he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of leaving them, worried about whether they would be okay without him. "We'll be okay because you taught us to be strong," Henry replied, "but it's not time to talk about that. You're going to be here for many more years." Thomas smiled, but sadly, like he knew something Henry didn't want to accept. They sat watching nightfall over the city, and Henry realized he had to make the most of every moment. Nothing is guaranteed. When Henry returned to his city a month later, he did so with a heavy heart. But Thomas insisted he was fine and said Henry didn't need to worry so much. "I'm okay, son," Thomas said as he helped Henry load his bags into the car. "You have your life now, go live it." The following months required adjustments for everyone. Thomas followed the doctor's orders strictly, but he was visibly more fragile. He stopped volunteering completely and spent most of his time at home, reading or watching movies. Sophia visited almost daily after work and called Henry with updates. "He's eating properly," she said in one call, "but he gets tired so easily." Yesterday, just going up the stairs, he had to sit. Henry went home every weekend he could. The trips were tiring but necessary. He needed to see with his own eyes that Thomas was all right. Camille always went with him, and she and Thomas had developed a special bond, talking about books and movies. Once Henry found them laughing at something on TV, and the sound of that laughter let him breathe easier. During one of those visits, Camille gathered everyone in the living room, her expression a mix of nerves and joy. She held Henry's hand and looked at each of them before speaking. "We have news," she began, then looked to Henry for encouragement. "I'm pregnant." Silence lasted only a second before Sophia screamed and leapt up to hug her. Thomas stood more slowly, but when he reached them, tears were running down his face. He hugged Camille first, then Henry, speaking broken words of emotion. "I'm going to be a grandfather," he kept repeating, as if saying it out loud would make it real. "I can't believe I'm going to be a grandfather." Mrs. Beatrice appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. When she heard the news, she cried too. She hugged Camille and said she would start knitting baby clothes right away. Sophia was already on her phone searching nursery decor ideas. "This baby will be so loved," Thomas said later when he and Henry were alone on the porch. "He'll have the best family anyone could have." "Just like you gave us," Henry replied, and Thomas squeezed his shoulder warmly. The pregnancy brought new energy to the whole family. Thomas seemed more animated and started making plans again for the future, talking about everything he would teach his grandson. He wanted to be present for every moment and was already thinking of stories to tell and places to show. "I'll take him fishing," Thomas said, eyes bright. "Teach him to ride a bike and tell him about the stars." Seeing his excitement, Henry felt immense relief. Thomas was looking forward, not back. The months of pregnancy passed in a flurry of appointments, preparations, and nervous anticipation. Each ultrasound was an event the whole family wanted to attend. Sophia decorated the nursery in Henry's home with a stars and moon theme. She spent weeks hand-painting tiny constellations on the walls, and when she finished, it was so beautiful Camille cried. Thomas bought the safest, comfiest crib he could find. "Nothing is too expensive for my grandson," he said when Henry protested the price. "Let me do this." In the 5th month, they did an ultrasound to find out the sex, and everyone was in the room when the doctor said it was a boy. Thomas squeezed Henry's hand almost painfully. After the exam, they all went to lunch, and the conversation was only about the baby. "Have you picked a name?" Thomas asked as they ate. Henry and Camille exchanged a look. She nodded, giving him permission to say it. Henry cleared his throat, emotion rising, wanting to do it right. "We thought of a few," he began, "but from the start only one really made sense." "Which?" Sophia asked, leaning in. "Thomas," Henry said, looking straight at his father. "We want to name him Thomas, if you'll allow it." Thomas's fork clattered against the plate, and he stared at Henry, unable to speak. Tears streamed down his face, and he didn't try to hide them. Sophia was crying too, and Mrs. Beatrice had to grab a napkin for her own eyes. "Are you sure?" Thomas finally managed, voice choked. "It's a big responsibility to carry my name." "We're absolutely sure," Camille replied. "You changed our lives, and we want our son to carry your name with pride." Thomas stood and came around the table to hug them both. He stayed there, arms around them, crying openly while other diners glanced over. No one in the family cared. "Thank you," Thomas said when he'd composed himself a little. "You have no idea what this means to me." "We do," Henry said, "because you mean everything to us." The months that followed were the happiest Henry had seen Thomas in a long time. He was constantly making plans and buying baby things, even though everyone insisted they already had plenty. He kept showing up with toys, clothes, children's books, saying his grandson needed it all. "You're going to spoil this child," Sophia complained, smiling. "It's my grandfatherly right," Thomas retorted without remorse. In the 7th month, Henry got a call from Mrs. Beatrice in the middle of the afternoon. She was crying so hard he could barely understand. When he finally pieced it together, the world stopped. Thomas had collapsed again and was in critical condition at the hospital. He and Camille dropped everything, jumped in the car, and drove faster than they should. The 3-hour trip felt like days. When they arrived, Sophia was in the waiting room with her boyfriend and Mrs. Beatrice. All their faces were marked by worry and exhaustion. "How is he?" Henry asked first, dread in his voice. "Grave," Sophia said, voice breaking. "His heart is very weak. The doctors said they've done all they can. Now we just wait." Henry's legs nearly gave way, and Camille steadied him. They were allowed into the room 2 at a time. When Henry finally saw Thomas, so many tubes, so many machines, he wanted to scream. This couldn't be the same strong man who had stopped on that road years ago. He went to the bed and took Thomas's hand. It was too cold. Thomas opened his eyes slowly. When he saw Henry, he tried to smile, but it was faint. "You came?" he whispered. "You didn't have to. You need to take care of Camille." "Don't say that," Henry answered, pulling a chair beside the bed. "I will always be here when you need me." Thomas squeezed his hand with what little strength he had and stared at the ceiling before speaking again. Every word seemed to cost immense effort. "I wanted so much to meet little Tommy," he said. Henry's chest cracked at the nickname. "I wanted to teach him so many things." "You will," Henry insisted, even knowing he was lying. "Just 2 more months." "You'll hold him." Thomas only smiled, and Henry knew he didn't believe it. They sat quietly until the nurse asked Henry to step out so Sophia could come in. Henry kissed Thomas's forehead and whispered that he would be back soon. The next days were a roller coaster of hope and despair. Sometimes Thomas rallied and could talk a little, other times he was so weak he didn't open his eyes. The family took turns, so he was never alone. One night, around 2 in the morning, Henry thought Thomas was asleep when he heard his voice. "Henry, are you there?" "I'm here," he answered, moving closer. "Do you need anything?" "I need you to listen," Thomas said, urgency in his voice. "I don't know how much time I have. I need to say some things." "Don't talk like that," Henry pleaded, tears rising. "You're going to be fine." "We both know I won't," Thomas replied with painful honesty. "So let me talk while I still can." Henry nodded, unable to trust his voice. Thomas began slowly. He said the years since he had found Henry and Sophia were the best of his life. He had found purpose and a happiness he hadn't known existed. He asked Henry to take care of Sophia, to make sure she would be okay, and to never forget where they came from. He asked Henry to tell little Thomas about him and about how their family had formed. That love isn't about blood. "You'll be an amazing father," he said, voice thinner, "because you learned from the best example. You learned from your grandmother. And from you," Henry replied, crying openly. "You taught me what it is to be a father, what unconditional love is." "Then pass it on," Thomas asked. "Take care of your son the way I tried to take care of you. Make him feel important and safe every day." "I promise," Henry said, holding his hand, "and I'll tell him all the stories about you. He'll know the incredible grandfather he had." Thomas smiled and closed his eyes, looking more at peace. Henry held his hand until dawn. When the others arrived in the morning, they found the two of them like that. Henry still holding tight, Thomas sleeping deeply. Later, the doctor said Thomas was stable, but his heart was terribly compromised. It was a matter of time, nothing left to do but keep him comfortable. The family decided to bring him home. If the end had to come, at least it would be in the place he loved. Mrs. Beatrice prepared the master bedroom with everything Thomas would need. They hired nurses for shifts, but most of the time the family took care of him. Henry took leave from work and stayed there, fully present. Sophia worked in the mornings and spent afternoons by his side, reading to him or just talking. Camille cooked his favorite foods, even knowing he would eat very little. Everyone needed to do something, even though it wouldn't change the ending. A week after he came home, Thomas rallied surprisingly. He managed to sit up and even walk a little around the house with help. Everyone's hopes rose, maybe a miracle. But the doctor explained it was common before the end, as if the body gave one last burst. Henry wanted to plug his ears and not hear that. Thomas took advantage of those lucid days to speak to each person alone. He called Sophia in and they talked for hours. When she came out, her eyes were red, but she was smiling. He did the same with Mrs. Beatrice, who had long been part of the family. With Henry, the conversation was different. They had already said so much that words were hardly needed. They just sat on the porch, like always, watching the garden, enjoying the comfortable silence of those who understand each other perfectly. "I'm not afraid," Thomas said suddenly. "The only thing that makes me sad is not seeing little Tommy grow up." "He'll know everything about you," Henry promised again, "every story, every lesson, every important moment." "Will you let him play in the pool?" Thomas asked with a crooked smile. "I will," Henry said, laughing even with tears on his face, "and I'll let him eat ice cream before dinner sometimes." "Good," Thomas said, satisfied. "Every grandkid deserves a little rebellion." They laughed together, one of the last good moments before he began to fade again. He slept almost all the time. The lucid moments grew rarer and shorter. On a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after he'd returned home, Henry woke to Mrs. Beatrice knocking on his door. He knew before she spoke. He ran, found Sophia already in Thomas's room, crying. Thomas was still alive, but his breathing was labored and uneven. The nurse said it was a matter of hours. Henry sat on one side of the bed and Sophia on the other, each holding a hand, while Camille and Mrs. Beatrice stood in the doorway. The hours passed slowly, painfully. Thomas didn't open his eyes again, but Henry was sure he knew they were there. He and Sophia kept talking to him, telling stories and remembering happy times. They wanted the last things he heard to be full of love. "Thank you for everything," Henry whispered close to his ear. "Thank you for stopping on that road. Thank you for believing in us. Thank you for being the best father anyone could have." Sophia leaned close and whispered her own farewell and gratitude, saying she loved him and would miss him every day. Thomas took a deeper breath, then grew still. The silence that followed was absolute. The nurse checked and confirmed what they already knew. Henry and Sophia kept holding his hands. They couldn't let go. They didn't want to accept that it was truly the end. Camille came and hugged Henry from behind, and Mrs. Beatrice wept against the wall. "He's gone," Sophia said, her voice so broken it barely came out. "He's really gone." Henry couldn't release Thomas's hand, even knowing he wasn't there anymore. He sat for an immeasurable time until Camille touched his shoulder and said they needed to let the nurse do what had to be done. He stood on shaky legs and hugged Sophia, who collapsed in sobs in his arms. In the days that followed, there was a haze of practical decisions and paperwork that had to be handled even with a broken heart. Henry took on most of it because Sophia could barely hold a pen without her hands shaking. He sat with the funeral director, chose a simple mahogany casket and a quiet service at the house. No chapel, no cavernous room that swallowed sound. He hated echoes, Sophia said, and Henry nodded. They scheduled it for Friday afternoon, when the light would be soft in the garden Thomas loved. People came Henry had never met, and some he knew by heart. A few men from Thomas's finance world with polished shoes and careful voices. 2 social workers who had fought beside him years ago to make the adoption fast and clean. 3 teenagers he'd mentored at the community center. Now lanky, shy young adults, clutching the kind of grief that makes you stand straighter. Mrs. Beatrice had baked more than anyone could eat and still fussed that it wasn't enough. The Rolls-Royce sat at the curb, washed and quiet, like a faithful old dog waiting at the door. Before the service, Henry went into Thomas's office to find a photo for the table. He opened the top drawer and found a blue folder labeled, in Thomas's neat block letters, "If the day ever comes." Inside was a single-page letter addressed to "My kids." Henry stood there for a long time with the paper in his hands, then took it outside. He read it in the garden. His voice broke once, and he didn't bother to hide it. "If the day ever comes, and I'm not there to say it, thank you for choosing me back. Keep Friday pizza nights. Keep the pool loud in summer and the library quiet when it needs to be. Teach little Thomas that love is a verb you do on the boring days. Give Sophia the library when you're ready. She'll turn it into a kingdom. Henry, the watch in my top drawer belonged to Mr. Paul. It ticks because he believed in me when I didn't. Wear it when you need courage. The car is for you both to argue over. Resolve it by taking turns to drive to places that matter. And please, if you can bear it, take me once more to the road where we met. If not in body, then in story. That's where we all began to become ourselves. With love, always. Dad." Sophia pressed a hand to her mouth. Mrs. Beatrice cried openly, the way only someone who has seen the beginning and the end dares to cry. When it was her turn, Sophia spoke not from a paper, but from the soft place in her chest. "He could have passed by," she said. "He stopped. That's it. That's the whole story of our family. Someone stopped. They buried Thomas's ashes beneath the maple in the back corner of the yard, where the shade fell just right in late afternoon. Henry set a small bronze plaque at the base. To the families we choose." After everyone left, he and Sophia sat on the porch with Camille and watched the wind make the leaves whisper. The house felt emptier and somehow fuller at the same time. Grief came in waves that didn't ask permission. Some mornings it was a thin film over everything, other days it was an undertow that dragged without warning. When it got bad, Henry found the letter, read the part about boring day love, and went to do something ordinary. Take out the trash, fold laundry, call Sophia to complain about the price of oranges, until the undertow let go. 2 weeks later, while Henry was replacing the porch light Thomas had always said he'd get to, Camille's voice floated from the doorway. "Don't panic," she said calmly, which meant there was something to panic about. "But I think we need to go to the hospital." It was a month before the due date. The overnight bag was half packed and the car seat still in its box, but somehow they got it done. Sophia barking orders, Mrs. Beatrice finding everything nobody else could. The drive felt both too long and not long enough. Labor was long but uncomplicated. Between contractions, Camille made Henry promise to teach their son how to flip pancakes on Sunday mornings. "He has to know the right amount of syrup," she insisted, then winced and gripped his hand again. Just before dawn, the room filled with a bright, brand-new cry. The doctor placed a squirming, furious, perfect boy on Camille's chest. Henry forgot how to breathe and remembered at the same time. "Hi, little man," he whispered. "Welcome to the world." They named him Thomas Paul, Paul for the man whose kindness had set the first ripple going, and Thomas because some names aren't just names, they're lanterns. On the second night, after the nurses had done their rounds and Camille slept, Henry sat in the dark with his son against his chest. The hospital lights made a thin halo on the floor. The baby's breath was warm and damp on his shirt. "You're going to hear a lot of stories," Henry said, keeping his voice low. "I'll tell you the one about a road when you're ready. For now, you were wanted and you were waited for, and you were named after a man who chose us. They brought him home to the Stars and Moon nursery Sophia had painted by hand. She stood in the doorway, speechless for once. Then she laughed through tears and said, 'He looks like a potato.' It was the highest of Sophia's compliments. Mrs. Beatrice hovered with a blanket, then two, then decided he was warm enough with one. That night, the house felt right again. Different, but right, like a chord with a new note added that changed the whole song. Henry found the watch in Thomas's drawer. It was heavy and honest, the kind of watch that made you stand straighter. He wound it and slid it on, and the tick was a steadying thing. "Okay," he said to the empty office. "Okay, I'll try to be the man you thought I already was." They kept pizza on Fridays. It tasted like dough and basil and an ongoing promise. On Sunday mornings, Henry tried to make pancakes the way Thomas did. Too big the first time, too brown the second, just right on the third. When little Tommy was old enough to sit in a high chair, he smacked the tray with both hands and shouted at the stack as if it might run away. Somewhere in the house, the clock ticked like a small, faithful heart. In spring, when the maple put out new leaves the color of bright apple skins, Henry and Sophia drove the old Rolls-Royce to that road. The car started on the first try, a quiet purr like approval. Camille sat in the back with the baby. Sunlight fell in strips through the trees. They parked where the shoulder widened, by a utility pole that must have been replaced since then, and yet still looked exactly the same in the way that places do when they hold a memory. Henry took the baby and stood with him facing the road. "Here," he said softly. "This is where a man stopped." He didn't cry. There would be other days for that. Today there was a kind of clear-throated gratitude that felt like crisp water. Sophia slid her arm through his. "He'd like that you brought him," she said. The breeze lifted the baby's hair. Somewhere a meadowlark tried out 3 wrong notes before it found the right one. Back home, Henry hung a framed copy of Thomas's letter in the hallway, right where you had to pass it to get anywhere important. Underneath, he put a small shelf with a jar of Lego pieces and a wooden car, objects a small boy would reach for without needing permission. Above it, he fixed a new plaque, one line added to the old refrain, "To the families we choose and the stories we keep." Time did what time does. Camille went back to work, and Henry learned the impossible dance of residency schedules and bedtime stories. He finished his training and stayed at the hospital that had trained him, the pediatric cardiology wing, becoming a place he could walk blindfolded. On the wall of his office, he kept a print Sophia made for him. 2 figures on a roadside, the horizon opening like a door. She called her studio Lantern Road and never lacked for clients. On opening nights, she wore sneakers under fancy dresses and said it was for running toward ideas. The house changed in small, respectful ways. One chair in the living room kept a dent that no other chair ever would. The game room upstairs became half playroom, half sanctuary. The pool was busy in summer and quiet in winter, just as Thomas had commanded. Once, in August, when the heat pressed everything flat, Henry woke to find little Tommy in his pajamas, forehead pressed to the glass, watching the pool. "Can we swim before breakfast?" he asked. Henry imagined Thomas's crooked smile and said, "Just this once." They ate ice cream afterward at 9 in the morning with spoons too big for their mouths. Later, Henry put a sticky note on the fridge that read, "Grandpa Rule." On the day little Tommy took his first wobbly steps from the couch to Henry's open arms, the watch on Henry's wrist ticked loudly enough to hear. He looked up by habit toward the office, as if expecting to see Thomas leaning in the doorway, pretending not to cry. There was only sunlight. It was enough. Years passed the way good years do, their shape learned only in retrospect. Sophia married the designer who'd helped her pick fonts for her first show, and they danced in the garden under strings of borrowed lights. Mrs. Beatrice retired from cooking for everyone else and started teaching little Tommy the secret to her vanilla cookies. Henry and Camille filled the nursery with books and blocks, and a blue bowl of smooth stones from every place they traveled. One day they would label them, they said, and one day became many days, and that was all right. On the anniversary of Thomas's passing, they gathered by the maple. Some years they spoke, some years they didn't. This time, when Tommy was 5 and impatient with stillness, Henry handed him a small paper lantern with a battery candle inside. Together they set it at the base of the tree. "Why do we do this?" Tommy asked, wide-eyed, not yet used to the idea that love asks for rituals. "Because light finds its way," Henry said, "even when it's dark." When the boy was 7, Henry took him to the hospital on a Sunday, empty halls and vending machines humming. He showed him the ward where tiny hearts learned how to keep going. "Your middle name is for a man who helped your grandpa," Henry said. "Your first name is for the man who helped me. Every day I try to be worth both." Tommy didn't understand, not fully, but he reached for Henry's hand with absolute trust. Sometimes that's the most understanding anyone needs. On an ordinary Thursday, not a holiday, not an anniversary, Henry woke early and made pancakes. He flipped them just right and set the syrup on the table without thinking too hard about how much. Camille shuffled in, hair wild, stealing the first bite. Tommy barreled down the stairs and launched himself into a chair. Outside, the maple moved like someone waving from far away. The house hummed with its low, steady music, clocks, pipes, footsteps, a laugh in another room. Henry looked around and felt the shape of his life settle again into place. A watch ticking, a letter on the wall, a plaque by a tree, a boy with syrup on his chin, a sister who would be by in an hour with a new print rolled under her arm. A car in the driveway, older than any of them, had a right to be. A promise renewed in 100 small ways, especially on the boring days. He raised his coffee mug the way Thomas had raised his glass years ago. "To new beginnings," he said. Camille smiled. Tommy clinked his milk against the mug and said it back, sure and clear, as if repeating a family password. "To the families we choose."